Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of the very first sessions of the 2021 Virtual MDF Annual Conference. I'm Kate Beck, the Special Projects Manager at MDF, and I'll be introducing our speaker today. I'm delighted to be here and excited to meet and see some of you over the course of the weekend. This session is Acceptance and Commitment, Strategies for Good Mental Health with Dr. Chris D. Graham. This session is part of the Caregivers track, Caregivers and Self-Care track, and it's intended for caregivers or individuals living with all forms of DM. This session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the conference at the MDF Digital Academy at myotonic.org/digital academy. To ask me or our presenters questions throughout the session, or to make a comment, please use the chat function on the sessions page. There'll be a question and answer portion at the end of the session, and we'll try to address all of your questions then. Now I'm delighted to introduce our presenter, Dr. Chris Graham. Excuse me, let me share my screen here for a second. Okay. Dr. Chris Graham is a clinical psychologist, senior lecturer in clinical psychology, and academic director of the clinical psychology training program at Queen's University Belfast. His research mostly involves testing the efficacy of acceptance and commitment therapy for improving outcomes across several different clinical contexts. For example, for improving quality of life in health conditions, or reducing burnout in clinicians themselves, or reducing self-harm in people who repeatedly self-harm. Dr. Graham completed his professional doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Edinburgh and a PhD at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, King's College London, developing a psychological intervention for improving well-being in people living with muscular dystrophy. His clinical work largely involves helping people to live well with neurological conditions. He maintains a small caseload in the Department of Clinical Neuropsychology at the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. So without further ado, Dr. Chris Graham.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. And it's lovely to be here at the MDF conference. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And hopefully this will work. Okay, folks, can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
When you can. Okay. So as Kate mentioned there, I'm going to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a type of therapy that I use in my clinic, where I work with people with neuromuscular conditions. Within the talk, and I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes, I should say, and leave about 15 minutes then at the end for questions, if anybody has any. Within my talk today, I'm going to talk about what psychological interventions do and why they might be helpful for living with conditions like myotonic dystrophy. And then after that, I'm going to focus in on acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'm going to, at the end, I'm going to introduce some psychological skills that are derived from ACT. And it's going to be more of an introduction to those skills as opposed to a comprehensive examination of them. I want to get you interested and yeah, maybe consider some further reading. Okay, so just to begin with, what do psychological interventions do and why might they be helpful in myotonic dystrophy? Okay, so what we know and what many of you know a lot better than me is that myotonic dystrophy can be difficult to live with. So obviously there's the symptoms that people experience and there can be ranges of different symptoms. These impact on what people can and can't do, you know, in terms of how people function at work and how they function within relationships and socializing as well. And also sometimes they require people to progressively adapt what they do as weakness progresses. Unsurprisingly, given some of these challenges, people have natural emotional responses. So it's normal at times to feel frustration. Sometimes people feel anxiety, fear about the future, embarrassment, apathy. There's all sorts of emotional responses within this context. Sometimes as well, within the context of living with a long-term condition like myotonic dystrophy, people can start to reflect on who they are and what living with a condition like this means for them. So it's not all negative living with a long-term condition. Within it, people often report opportunities for growth as well. They report that enables them to focus on the relationships and to really sort of boil their activities and their focus down to the stuff that really matters. Okay, so given the context that I've just described and some of the challenges and opportunities that are implicit within it, it's unsurprising that psychological variables and psychological factors seem to be important in explaining quality of life. So what we know from numerous different studies is that things like how people cope, whether they use helpful coping mechanisms like seeking support from others, or whether it's less helpful ones like relying on substances or venting or giving up what's important. We know that that coping mechanism predicts quality of life. We also know that how people regulate their emotions, so how they calm themselves down if they're feeling anxious, or motivate themselves if they're feeling low, also predicts quality of life. Beliefs about the condition, so how optimistic or pessimistic you feel about your future with your condition will affect your quality of life as well. And then also self-efficacy, how motivated people are and confident they are in their ability to change things. And these variables predict quality of life over and above disease severity variables, which is important. Okay, so if we combine all the variables I've just described, we get an overarching psychological process called psychological flexibility. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later in more detail, because this is what acceptance and therapy focuses on changing. I'll come to that. Okay, so what do psychological interventions involve? Well, they help people understand what they're doing and try to think about changing things that are maintaining negative well-being and try and focus on doing things that promote positive well-being. Different types of therapies focus in on different psychological processes. So some focus on changing beliefs, so therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy. Psychodynamic therapies might focus on helping people develop their insight into themselves and realize how their history might impact on their current life and way of approaching that. Psychological therapies have a goal, and it's often to improve things like adjustment or mood or well-being. So in my clinic in Belfast, people are often referred for difficulties with adjusting to living with a long-term condition, or the emotional impact of living with a long-term condition as well, fears about the future or feeling low. Nowadays, psychological therapies can be carried out in lots of different ways. So you've got individual therapy, which is what I do in my little clinic. Also, there's group-based interventions as well, and they're frequently used with chronic conditions. People use apps as well, so things like Headspace, which is a mindfulness app, and there's other apps as well, and also self-help books. There's one that I forgot to put in here, and it's one that we're using increasingly with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is video conferencing. So we now do a lot of our therapy sessions over Zoom and Teams and programs like that. And I should say that psychological treatments, it involves sort of examining yourself and your motivations and your history and thinking about how that brings to bear on how you behave in the present. Okay, so There's a big evidence base around psychological therapies just broadly. A lot of the evidence base is for mood, so for just generally helping people with low mood or anxiety. But there's a big evidence base for psychological therapies in helping people adjust to living with a long-term condition as well. We know that therapies like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and mindfulness that you might have heard of as well, psychodynamic therapy as well, and acceptance and commitment therapy now have got evidence suggesting that they are helpful for things like adjustment and mood in the face of living with the condition. To my knowledge, there's been one large trial of psychological therapies in myotonic dystrophy specifically, and that's the Optimistic trial that was carried out in the Netherlands by Kees Akkersen, and it looked at CBT for improving just social participation, so getting involved in everyday life activities. And what it showed is that CBT was efficacious for that. It did help people enjoy and get more out of their daily life. So that's important to know about that. Okay, so what is acceptance and commitment therapy? It's a newer type of cognitive behavioral therapy. As I said before, it aims to engender this quality called psychological flexibility, which again, I'll come to in just a second. What's interesting about acceptance and commitment therapy is it's specifically about doing more of the things that are important to you, as opposed to feeling less bad. So it's not about feeling less depressed or feeling less anxious. It is about doing more of what's important. Acceptance and commitment therapy is informed by lots of different theories, but interestingly as well, it's informed by contemplative traditions. Things like Buddhism as well will feed into some of the genesis of acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness practice too. Now, ACT is experiential, and by that, what I mean is it helps people focus on themselves and what they do and whether what they do works. So I'm just going to invite you, if you're willing, and if you think it would be beneficial and not harmful for you to do so, I'd like you to self-reflect a little bit, because that'll help us as we move into the next stage where I get into describing psychological flexibility. So if you'd like to, just take a second and bring to mind some tricky situations that are present in your life at the moment. You don't have to get into the deep, dark stuff. It can be frustrations at work or other frustrations. And with those situations in mind, I'd like you to think about the emotions and thoughts that those situations bring, and then how you cope, what you do in the face of those emotions and those thoughts. And then finally, does what you do work for you? Does it make things better, or does it make things worse? I'll just give you a few moments to contemplate this. I'm going to do the same. Oh. Okay, maybe that's enough reflection. So just thinking about this, in the face of a difficult situation, so be it a difficulty at work, an argument within the family, or it could be a frustration that myotonic dystrophy is bringing to your life. People naturally have difficult emotions. So what do you do to cope with those difficult emotions? Well, people do lots of things in the short term. So sometimes people avoid the situation that brings a difficult experience. So they avoid talking to that person, they avoid going to that place. Sometimes people do things to regulate the emotions. They might overeat, eat too much chocolate, they might drink alcohol. Sometimes people might do things that seem more helpful. So they might try and think, sort of reframe things and think about things in a more positive way. They might see things as a challenge. The crucial thing for acceptance and commitment therapy is not what you do, it's whether what you do works. And in acceptance and commitment therapy, that's not about reducing, as I said earlier, the extent of difficult emotions that might be present. It's about whether what you do actually builds the type of life you want. And I'm going to come to that just now. So psychological flexibility is what ACT aims to change. So to be effective and grow, you first need to have a sense of what's important to you, where you want to go in life, what you value deeply, the type of person you want to be and become. And then consistently choose to do things that align with those values. So if creativity is important to you, then seeking out opportunities to be creative. If intimacy is something that's important to you, then behaving in ways that are consistent with intimacy in your relationships. Now, what's interesting is if you think about anything if you think about a behavior that would be consistent with your own values or something that you might have done that's important. So it could be something like a job interview for a job you really wanted. It could be before you walk down the aisle, if you're married, or before you went on a date. What you might notice is in and amongst all the positive emotions, so the excitement, the anticipation, the enjoyment, there might have also been within that palette of emotion, there might have been a little bit of anxiety in there, a bit of embarrassment, a number of different emotions as well. So in order to do what's important, it's often necessary to be willing to have difficult emotions. Also, when you go to do something important as well, you might notice that your mind gets very busy. It starts giving you thoughts about what could go wrong, what might happen, what others might think often. And so to be effective and grow, it's often helpful to notice that thoughts are your mind, they're the machinations of your mind, they're not literal real things. So to be able to step back from thoughts and thinking and from your mind when that's helpful. And then also to be able to be present in the moment. So instead of getting caught up in your mind and worrying and thinking about what could go wrong or ruminating what has gone wrong, you're able to just be present. You're able to focus on what's in front of you, the important person you're with in the here and the now. Now, there has to be a bit of flexibility here because sometimes it's important to go into our minds. If you think about going out to do your shopping at your local store, you have to remember the shopping list, so you have to go into your head sometimes, but sometimes equally we can get stuck in our heads too. And then it's important to be present. And then also to be able to look at yourself and your history from different perspectives. This one's a bit more challenging to describe, but we're going to get to some skills later that will help you make contact with what that might mean. But psychological flexibility is the combination of this process. It's about being open, aware, and engaged. And what we know from numerous different studies is that psychological flexibility predicts quality of life and mood and well-being in addition to disease severity in muscle diseases and in lots of other conditions as well. Okay, so as I said a bit earlier, acceptance and commitment therapy aims specifically to enhance psychological flexibility. So what I wanted to do was spend a bit of time introducing you to some psychological flexibility skills. So the skills that I'm going to introduce you to are ones that we've tried out. Some of them we've tried out in the ACTMIS trial, which was a randomized controlled trial of acceptance and commitment therapy for improving quality of life in muscle diseases. And some of them are in it from another trial that's ongoing at the minute, the ACTION trial. Okay. So before I get into the skills, it's first of all useful to acknowledge this. So if you look at this picture, you might notice that this advice in the face of a tsunami is a bit absurd. And similarly, what do you make of this advice? And I think why it's important to show this is because if you're struggling at times with myotonic dystrophy, if you're struggling with some of the challenges it puts in front of you or your family member, and you're having difficult emotions, like frustration, embarrassment, fear, anger, any number of things. Those emotions just reflect the situation you find yourself in. It doesn't mean that you're broken or you're damaged if you feel frustrated at times or you feel angry or anxious. Okay, so I just wanted to get that clear at the start. Okay, so into the skills. The first skill that's derived from psychological flexibility is about increasing your awareness of what's important to you, and then also doing more things that are consistent with your values. So there's two parts to this skill. The first part is about connecting with the qualities you want to show in your life, the values that you want to bring to bear in your behaviors. And then the second part is about trying consistently to undertake activities that reflect those behaviors. So just starting with the first one. So values are qualities that you want to show in your life. Here in red are a list of some possible values that might be relevant to you. Some might be relevant to you, others might not. There's hundreds of possible values. I've just zoomed into a few here. So values are a bit like a compass point. So they provide a direction of travel. If you think about kindness, kindness is something that you can do in lots of your activities in an ongoing basis. You can bring it to bear in your relationships with your family or friends by choosing to say that nice thing you normally don't, or to do that nice thing that you normally don't, or to step outside of your comfort zone and buy that nice thing that you might not normally buy. But like a compass point, they're a direction of travel. So kindness isn't something that you become once and for all if you do something kind. So it's an ongoing direction. Okay, so values differ from goals because a goal is a concrete thing you could do. So bringing it into our metaphor, a goal is more like a destination within your overall journey. So a goal that reflects kindness might be choosing each day to specifically say something that you know your partner would benefit from hearing. That would be a goal, and that would be consistent with your value of kindness. In acting therapy, lots of the conversations we have with people are about really helping them connect with their values. So I might be interested in what's really important to them. As they're talking and we're having conversations about life in general, if they do touch on things that seem important, either things that are particularly painful, and I'll come to why that is in a second, or things where they really lift when they're talking about that topic, then we'll stay with it and we'll linger on it. And this is about really sort of leaning into values, helping them clarify what's important to them. Now, sometimes people struggle to make contact with their values because in everyday life, we don't often make space to think about what's really important to us and to clarify it. So there's some tasks that you can use within ACT that help you think about what's important to you. So here are a few. One is to sort of contemplate on, imagine you've inherited a fortune. What would you buy with it? With whom would you share those experiences that money can buy? Another that might help you self-reflect is to look at things from the other perspective. What do you disapprove or dislike of in the actions of others? Okay, again, that can help you clarify what isn't valued to you and what is the antithesis of your values. Also, another way we help people reflect on values and really get clarity on them is see if you can remember a time, the last time you really felt alive or felt connected to something bigger. What were you doing and what qualities were you showing within your behavior? Were you doing things that reflect compassion, that reflect presence, that reflect vitality? What was it? So that's the first part of skill one. It's about getting clarity on what's important to you. Values differ between all of us, and it's not about what you should value. It's about what you do value. So we try to help people sort of disentangle what society or family or learning tells them they should like, and really what is important to them, what really like makes their heart leap. So that's a part of it. The other part of values is about trying to, within your everyday behavior, do things that reflect your values. The idea is that if you're doing this, then life should get bigger and richer over time, even with difficult emotions as part of the picture. So one way in which we help people to notice opportunities to do more of the things that are important to them is this task with the boxes called the values compass. So if you look at these 6 boxes, you can see that they cover different possible areas in life. And what we have people do is we have them reflect on what's important to them in these different areas. And there's more boxes than this. I've just made it 6, and not all the boxes apply to everyone all the time. If you're not working, then work might not be important, for example. Spirituality is in there, and if you're not spiritual, that might not be important to you. You might not have values in there. But we help them think about these different categories of life, and then we have them write down their values in those areas. So if we look at intimate relationships, they might really have a value around compassion or kindness or encouragement of partners, for example. So we might have them write that down, and then we ask them, you can see that there's 2 little boxes within each of the 6 boxes. We ask them in the upper square to, out of 10, rate how important that value is to them in their everyday life. If it's extremely important, it would be 10 out of 10. If it's not important at all, it would be 0. And then in the bottom square, we ask them to reflect on how consistently in their everyday life are they doing things that reflect this value of, for example, encouragement. Now, what's interesting about this is for everybody I've done this task with, there's been a gap between how important things are to them and how consistently they're doing them. So if they put an 8 for encouragement, and then they put a 5 for how consistently they're doing things that reflect it, then there's a gap between how they want to be within their behavior and maybe how they are being within their behavior. So noticing these gaps can be really helpful because it can help you notice areas where you might be able to grow and opportunities to enrich life and get more out of life. What's also interesting about this task as well is that it brings people into contact with pain. Sometimes when you look at what's important to you, and I know this is certainly the case for me, when you look at what's important to you and you reflect on how often you're doing things that reflect that, that gap can be very obvious, very salient. And that then introduces an opportunity for difficult emotions. And as we'll come to later, difficult emotions, and also as you would have seen earlier when I was talking about difficult emotions being a part of what's important, difficult emotions do come along with values. We do seem to hurt where we care. All right, the positive side of this and the helpful side of this, I think noticing is helpful, but the particularly helpful side of it is that when people notice a gap, then we have them reflect on what they can do to get back on track with their values. The interesting thing about a value is that within our metaphor that we spoke about earlier of a compass, having values is a bit like a compass in the sense that if you're lost or you're off track, you can always reach back into your pocket and get the compass out again and then choose to move forward again in that direction. So by not having pursued your values for a while or done things that reflect your values, it doesn't mean that you've lost. It doesn't mean that you can't get back on track again. It still is very possible. So we often ask people to reflect on what steps they could take to get back on track with their values. What's interesting about this in clinic is when you do it, often people think of massive things to begin with. So if one of their values is vitality and health, then they might, say, well, right, I'm going to join the gym and I'm going to go to the gym every day. What we try to do is we try to get people to start with something much smaller than that to get them moving. So often I'll say, that's quite big. What's the smallest possible step you think you could make today, or even now, or even in the next hour to get back on track with your values? And often people can think of things like, well, I'm not going to have that candy bar that I normally have after dinner, or I'm going to choose to, maybe spend a bit more time on exercise. So they can often find small steps. It's about building momentum. Okay, the second skill is about learning to step back from difficult thoughts that get in the way of doing important things. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Okay, I'd like you to bring to mind, if you're willing and if you're all right with it, I'd like you to bring to mind maybe one of your values. You might have been reflecting on your values as I was speaking earlier, and then maybe think about contemplate now doing a new activity that reflects that value. Okay, now as you reflect on that new activity, it could be anything from joining a dating app to, having that difficult conversation with a colleague, paying your bills. It could be any number of things. I'd like you to notice what your mind does next, what thoughts you're having. Okay, if your mind is anything like my mind, what you might have noticed is that almost immediately, as soon as we start to think about doing things that would be important to us, we often get difficult thoughts. We get thoughts like, oh, that'll never work. I won't get time for that. Or that'll be a bit embarrassing, actually, when I think about it. I'll put it off to tomorrow. It's interesting that this is what our mind does when we begin to do important things. And this is just a real feature of being human. We seem to hurt where we care. When you think about doing something important, there's always the possibility for loss that comes along with it. So it's almost like a ticket. On the one side, you've got the show that you really want to see, the thing you care about. And on the other side, you've got the difficult thoughts and feelings that seem to come along with it. Pain is sort of part of the deal. Discomfort is part of the deal. Now, what's interesting is what you do next with those thoughts. As we said earlier, or as you might have experienced earlier with the cartoons I showed you about the person being given advice about the tsunami and the volcano, is that emotional responses are normal. And with values, difficult thoughts and feelings are normal when you start to do important things. So the question is not the difficult feeling or the difficult thought, it's what you do with those difficult thoughts. So there's lots of things that we do naturally that sometimes can be unhelpful. So we might hold on tight to that thought and live as though it's literally true as opposed to a thought. So for example, if our mind tells us that will never work, then we immediately buy into that as being a reflection of the truth. We hold on to it tight. Or if our mind tells us, that person really doesn't like me, and we hold on to that tight and live as though it's a truth. If we do that, it can keep our behavior stuck and narrow. Another thing we might do, or you might have noticed that you might have done with a difficult thought there, is you might try and work out whether that thing your mind is predicting is true. So your mind tells you that you'll make a fool of yourself. And then you start thinking about, actually, is that true? Actually, I've done this before, it went fine. But then you think, well, what if this is the exception, this one? And then again, you go back again, your mind might tell you, well, no, you're older and wiser now, you can do this. And then you might get another thought like, well, hold on, do you really know this well enough? Can you be sure that it's not going to go wrong? So what's interesting is we often worry next, and that's often about trying to work out what might happen to remove the discomfort of uncertainty. We also sometimes, when the thought is there, it often comes along with a difficult feeling, a difficult emotion, and therefore we might avoid the activity entirely because of the emotion. We think about putting ourselves on a dating app, and all of a sudden we feel embarrassed, and we avoid putting ourselves on that app because it avoids the emotions. So it's what you do next that's important. And if you do some of these unhelpful things, people will do helpful things as well. It's not only unhelpful things that people do. I don't want to misrepresent that. But if you do some unhelpful things, the way that you establish whether they work or not is to think about whether they become barriers. So does worrying become a barrier to doing what's important? Does buying into a thought as though it's a literal truth get in the way of doing what's important? Does trying to avoid the thought get in the way of doing what's important? If the answer to that is yes, then within ACT, some of the suggestions that the therapy proposes, again informed by contemplative traditions, might look a bit different, but I'm just going to describe them to you now. So the first thing is to notice if what you're doing is working, what we've just described. If not, then it's about being able to step back from the thought and to notice it's a thought. One very simple way to do that is something called verbal distancing. So if your mind has given you the thought that you're going to make a fool of yourself, so you notice you've had that thought and that thought's a bit of a barrier, or you're getting hooked into worrying or struggling with it, then you might remind yourself it's a thought by literally saying, I am having the thought that I'm going to make a fool of myself. Which reminds you it's the thought and gives you a bit of distance. If you want to further that distance, you can say to yourself, I notice I am having the thought that, which gives you another step back. From this space of noticing that it's a thought, reminding yourself and seeing that distance, you often have opportunity then to get back into the present moment, to focus on what's important, even with challenging thoughts as part of the picture. Okay, so that's an introduction to skill 2. Now we're on to skill 3, which is the one I find personally most interesting and increasingly personally more useful. So this is about approaching yourself with kindness. Remember at the very start, when I was introducing psychological flexibility, I spoke about how there's this part of psychological flexibility that's more tricky to explain. I'm going to explain that to you now. All right, so I'd like you to take a moment and just try an experiment. I'd like you to count from 1 to 10 in your head, and then from 10 to 1. So you count from 1 to 10, 10 to 1, and just keep doing that on repeat. And I'm just gonna give you 30 seconds to do that. Just put my stopwatch on. Okay, that was long enough. Right. What you might have noticed is that very quickly, so if it didn't happen already within 30 seconds, it almost always does within a couple of minutes. Very quickly within that simple task, what happens is our mind starts to interfere. It starts to chat and evaluate. So minds have this particular quality of being gossipy. They're always analyzing. It's what minds do. Yeah, they've evolved to be a certain way, but they're always analyzing. They're comparing to others or to other aspects of your life, and they're evaluating. All right, so they're a bit like a gossipy friend. Sometimes they tell you the truth. Sometimes they don't tell you the truth. Sometimes they describe things how they are. Sometimes they don't. Often it's hard to know. But one thing is clear, they don't really stop chatting. Now, what's interesting is as we develop as children, round about the age of 2 or so, we start to be able to notice ourselves and to reflect on ourselves, and we become part of the conversation. We compare ourselves to others, we evaluate our performance, we analyze ourselves, and we analyze the world in reference to ourselves. A particular other quality of the mind is that there's no such process as unlearning. We don't unlearn things. So our mind is a bit like a calculator with only plus or multiplication, no minus, or no division sign. We continually accrue information. Now, you might see a gap in that. You might think, well, I've forgotten things or I forget things. What's really interesting is even if you've forgotten things, a particular prompt will bring that thing to mind oftentimes. So a particular smell brings back a memory that you've not thought of in a long time. A particular face takes you back to a part of your life that you'd forgotten. So we don't really unlearn. So we carry all these evaluations and stories with us through our lives. And what this means is that over time, we gather lots of labels about ourselves. So stories about who we are, who we aren't, who we'll never be, who we'll always be. And often some of these labels can be quite deep and quite difficult. So it can be labels, things like, I'm unlovable, or I'm not as good as, I'll never be as good as my sister, or I'm incompetent, or I'm ugly, or numerous different labels like that. Some of these labels will be old. Some of these labels will be new. Some labels will feel very appropriate at the minute. Others will feel old. Now, what can happen when labels are around, particularly those really deep and dark labels that all of us carry about who we are, aren't, will never be, is that when we really get attached into them, they can hold our behavior and keep us focused on a narrow range of things. So if the label is, if the label I'm ugly is there, how likely are you to go out on that date? If the label I'm incompetent is there, how likely are you to speak up at that work meeting? Also, I should say that some labels, when we get attached to them, could be helpful. So things like, I'm capable might be a label that when we get attached to it can be really helpful. But sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So there's a label that I'd noticed I was carrying around for a while and bringing to work with me about being an expert in psychological therapy. Now that sounds really positive, but when I got really caught up in that label, what it meant is that I wasn't really learning anymore. I didn't really engage with books or with supervision in a way that I might have beforehand. So sometimes positive sounding labels can also keep our behavior stuck. So what can we do about these labels? I've said that, they're things that are learned in the past, they stick around, they're things that we carry with us often. Sometimes we think they're not there, but a certain instance can bring them back, or a certain situation or a certain group. Well, one of the things you can do potentially is step back like before. You might say to yourself, I notice I'm getting that story about being incompetent again. And that can help you in the first instance to notice it, to see it, to look at it. One of the things about labels is for many people in certain circumstances, is often when we try to think our way out of labels, so think about the evidence for and against being incompetent. Sometimes that doesn't get us there. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it can actually end up a bit like worrying, and we try to work out if it's true we're incompetent or not, or we were incompetent in that meeting. Interestingly, there's another way to approach labels, and they draw on a particular capacity of the brain and the mind to take a perspective shift and literally look at things from a different angle. So to show you what I mean, if you're willing and you think it would be helpful for you, I'd like you to bring to mind one of your labels that you have for you. So I'm bringing to mind my label of being incompetent. Okay, so with that label in mind, and noticing that label and noticing that label's there, I'd like you to bring to mind one of your friends or somebody you really like and feel warmth towards. Now, I'd like you to imagine them saying that thing about you that you say about yourself. So for me, that would be my friend saying that I'm incompetent. So I'd like you to do that as well. Okay, so as you heard your friend say those words about themselves, what urges did you have? You know, how did you want to respond to them? Is there anything you wanted to do for them? What's interesting is from this perspective of another, what we can often see is ways of responding to ourselves that might be more compassionate, that are just occluded from one perspective alone, that we can't see, that are hidden. So when I think about my friend saying, I'm incompetent, the first thing I want to do is I want to say, you know, you're not. I want to encourage that person. I want to spend time with them. I want to check they're okay. I want to be warm towards them. And I want them to know they're valued. And so the question is, with your stuff and your labels, if you were to approach yourself as though you were a friend from that perspective, do you think life would feel a bit more enriching? Do you think you'd be able to do more of the things that reflect how you want to be? Interestingly, with perspective shifting, that's just one example. Another perspective shift is you can shift in yourself in time. So with that label, you could think about you saying that label or say that label out loud and imagine within the room or talking to you is an older, wiser you. Say you, if you're younger, you in your 80s or you in your 90s, having been through a lot in life and being older and wiser. And then consider what might they say to you? What might you want them to say to you? Or from the perspective of that older person, what might you as you now look like? And what might you feel towards you or want to say towards you? What's interesting often in life is when we reflect back on ourselves as a younger person, as a younger man, a younger woman, we often can see compassion for some of the mistakes, ostensible mistakes that we might have made. And we think, wow, I wish I could say this to me then. It is something that's possible to do in the here and now, particularly around these labels. Okay, so that's skill 3. So what I've spoken about there is just 3 possible skills from acceptance and commitment therapy and just introduced you to the skills. That's not the entirety of the skill, and that's not the entirety of the ways in which you can make contact with those skills, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of what's involved. If I've piqued your interest and you're interested in acceptance and commitment therapy for you, and I know that therapy isn't always easy to access for many people, but if you're interested in that, I can recommend some books. So there's a really good book by Ray Owen called Facing the Storm, and that's acceptance and commitment therapy specifically for people that are living a life with a long-term health condition. There's one called The Happiness Trap as well, which is generically useful for considering and doing more of the things that are important to you. And then if mindfulness is more your thing, then there's a book there by Vidyamala Birch as well, which is excellent, and it's about applying mindfulness in the context of a long-term health condition. If you're a therapist, then I can recommend these 3 books. ACT Made Simple is accessible for newer therapists or therapists who are newer to ACT. There's 2 intermediate books there, and then there's the Black Belt ACT book, which is Mastering the Clinical Conversation by Matt Filat for more experienced therapists. Okay, so just to summarize, and thank you all for bearing with me to this point. But just to summarize, ACT is a newer type of therapy that emerges from contemplative traditions. The evidence base is growing with evidence that it can be helpful in long-term conditions. And we've done the Actimus trial with people with muscle diseases, albeit not with muscular dystrophy, and the outcomes were very positive there. As yet, there's been no trial of ACT with myotonic dystrophy, but there has been a trial of other psychotherapies in myotonic dystrophy, and the outcomes were very positive from that, the Ockerson trial. And I'm hoping that you've got a bit of a sense today of what psychological flexibility is and some of the ways in which you can help develop it in your life. With that, I'd just like to allow space and time for some questions, so just 15 minutes. So yeah, thank you very much. I don't know, Kate, if you're coming back in to help with the questions, or shall I just?
Yeah, what we'll do is please submit your questions into the chat box on the session page, and I will read them to Dr. Graham, and I will also, Dr. Graham, I'll send them to you over Zoom, so you'll see them in your chat box as well, in case you need to come back to them. So please, everyone, think of your questions and your comments.
There's one question from Erica, or one comment from Erica, who mentioned that she likes the 2-minute rule, which is a really excellent classic therapy method, which is about just starting something. So taking 2 minutes to start something. It also applies to worrying as well. And people talk about worry time. So if you're someone who's prone to worry, like me, then worry time is about giving yourself 15 minutes in the day where you can just worry for 15 minutes. You literally set the clock, sit there, worry, and then try for the rest of the day to know that you've done your worrying, you've had your worry diet completed, and then get back into your day with the rest of it. And if you get worries in the upcoming day, then you can jot them down, and then the next day you can use those worries in your subsequent worry time. So thank you for that, Erica.
And then we also have a comment from Jennifer Johnson, who said, my thinking often stops me.
Yeah, so does mine, Jennifer. So I think it's really common that, as I say, when we start to do important things, that we get thoughts that often become barriers, and we think about, our mind takes us to the most dreadful possible outcome, or reminds us of that one time when it went really badly wrong. And then when we really get caught up in those, it can get in the way. So it's about learning to find a way to be with your thoughts so they're not barriers. And that's what all psychological therapies, I think, do, and ACT as well does that. So thanks, Jennifer.
I'm still waiting for some questions, Dr. Graham. We can leave some time and space. Oh, we just got one.
Hey.
I'll paste it over to you. We got a couple.
Is that Laura? So Laura, you've asked if I'm aware of other therapies, nutritional or otherwise, that help the brain overcome stress. Well, I think there's lots of things that can help with stress. So I mean, diet can help. So having a balanced diet, I mean, you know this, diet can help. Exercise is excellent. If that's possible for you, then exercise is really helpful for stress. There's also other things. So I spoke about mindfulness earlier on. It can be really useful to get into the present moment as a way to let stress settle down. So mindfulness is a way to be present and engage with what you're doing in the moment. Sometimes people find it really useful to use mindfulness when they're out and about. So for me, I trained in London, and I don't know if any of you know London or are from London, but it's got a really sort of labyrinthine underground network. And I used to get the underground in every day. And what I would do is, when I got off the underground train and was walking to my hospital, I would consciously try to be present in the moment and step back from my mind when it was taking me into the day's problems. And what that meant is, when I got to work, I was present. Stress might still have been there, but it wasn't at the fore of my thinking. So mindfulness, I think, is something that can help you engage well with stress. Erica, do you have any strategies for people who are having a hard time deciding what's important to them?
And then just below that, you'll see, she said, for example.
Oh, sorry, Erica. Yeah.
She's got it's sort of.
Yeah, cool. What do you enjoy doing? My family's response was I don't know. What resources or strategies? Yeah, so I know that within myotonic dystrophy, often people can struggle with motivation at times, and that can be a feature of the condition. Or sometimes just, when life is hard, or when we haven't thought about it before as well, and we can struggle to connect with or be motivated with these things. I think one of the things that's really useful that makes it a bit more concrete is to reflect on the last thing that you really enjoyed, or the thing that you enjoy on an everyday basis. And that can be really helpful for getting people to think about what's important to them and connect with their values, because it's quite concrete. So if I reflect back through my day, and one of the things I really enjoyed earlier on was meeting with a colleague to talk about ideas, and just reflecting on that now, probably about just creativity and thinking is what that sort of tells me about what I care about. So I think that can help as well. Sometimes with reduced cognitive abilities, we're doing a trial at the minute of ACT in motor neuron disease, where there's also central involvement, and it can affect thinking and cognition as well. And we just try and make things a bit more concrete with some of the metaphors that we use. And we also maybe make some of the practices a bit more concrete as well. So instead of getting into more detailed discussions about values and thinking about values as a compass, we might just talk about what's important to you and how can you do more of it. So just boiling it down to what's essential. I can see there's more questions, and I'm sort of mindfulness in the tube is a whole other level. That's right, Laura?
Yeah. I can read them out for you too. The next
okay,
one
yeah, cool.
Ryan Sanford. What tactics do you use to help people not only get started, but maintain consistency with psychological flexibility?
Yeah, cool. There's loads, but just to zoom in on one. So what you want is you want people to notice, to get the positive feedback from doing things that are consistent with what they care about. So if somebody comes into my clinic and we've set a goal the week before and they do it, so say it is about responding to their family with a bit more kindness, every day trying to say something positive to their partner. When they tell me about doing that in clinic, what I'll say is, wow, what did that feel like? Or how did you feel like after you'd done it? Or as you talk about that now, does it feel like progress? So we try to get them in contact with the literal feeling or emotion or sensation of progress that happens after doing what's important or starting to do what's important. If you're interested in psychology, and without necessarily getting too technical, hopefully, this is about reinforcers. It's about helping somebody have a beneficial consequence from doing something that's important to them. So we try to get them in contact with the internal reinforcers, the stuff that's inside of them, the feelings, the sense of progress. So Ryan, that's just a part of that answer.
Yeah, we have a question from Martha Montag Brown. She says, I'm thinking of this in the context of a caregiver, how to apply this when watching a loved one who's struggling and seeing how it impacts every family member differently.
It does impact every family member differently. And within the situation, people have, they're looking at struggling from different perspectives. They're seeing their other and they're seeing themselves. And sometimes they're seeing things that their family member can't see as well. And naturally, you'll have difficult emotions to it. So I think it does apply to the caregiver as well. Because again, it is about having some difficult emotions when you see your family member struggling, and then being able to consider how you can respond in effective ways, both for them, ways that you think are going to be helpful, even in the midst of feeling really angry yourself or really upset. And also for you, ways that reflect the way you want to be, the type of daughter or partner or mother or father of that person. So yeah, it does apply. So thank you for that reflection, Martha.
We have one from Steph. Any thoughts on stopping nervously biting the inside of one's mouth? I've been doing this for years and haven't been able to stop.
I think with these, it sounds like you're wanting to stop, Steph, from what you said. With these, it's often useful to, think about whether it reflects other things. So is it about anxiety? And if it is, because Steph, I won't get a chance to talk to you personally, but if it is, then it might be worth seeking out some input from a healthcare professional. But if it's not about anxiety and it's just a bad habit that you've got into, then it might be about noticing urges, noticing when it happens, where it happens, noticing the urge what it begins with, trying to notice that initial sort of feeling that then leads to it, and then trying to find ways to do different things in the presence of that urge. But if it reflects something bigger, if there's something bigger behind it, Steph, then yeah, you might want to look around and see if there's any utility and help with that.
How can you help with additional isolation from COVID, during COVID?
Well, again, it's another challenging situation, isn't it? Often it's harder to connect with friends and family members during that. And obviously within that, you're going to feel some sadness and loneliness potentially and other difficult emotions. So again, it's similar. It's about trying to find ways to not be derailed by those very natural emotions and trying to do things that reflect your values in that scenario. So 2 ways to help would be to just be kind to yourself for the emotional response, maybe get a sense of what's important to you and consider how you can be doing what's important to you, even in the midst of feeling sad or frustrated or lonely. Do I have resources to share? Erica, I wish I did, but because that particular intervention is in trial at the minute, I'm not allowed to share the resources, so I'm sorry, but I can't. John's question?
Yeah, I think it's more of a comment. He just wanted to say he was +1ing on Erica B's question about cognitive disabilities.
Yeah.
He said it's helpful thinking about his son.
I do think, so my clinic in Belfast is a neuropsychology clinic, so we often do a cognitive assessment, and that's where we test people's memory and their attention and their ability to stay focused on things and to organize their thinking, just to check whether the diagnosis that they have might be through central pathology in the brain might be impacting on their cognition. So we do that, and then that often informs the therapy that we deliver. So if somebody's struggling with memory, then we make sure to repeat at the end and give written guidance leaving, and try not to overburden them with too many things to take away, for example. So often when we're delivering therapy in the context of central involvement, then we think about how we can adapt it. So yeah, just sort of riffing on what you said there, John and Erica.
Looks like we have another question from, here we go, from Mackie. He says, my son's, I have DM1 and so does my son. My repeats were much lower in my 60s when I was 63 years of age. My son's repeats are 250. It's so hard to see him decline. He will not do anything to help himself. I feel we're enabling him and wonder what is practical to set as expectations.
Well, Mikey, that's a big one. And I just want to say, it sounds hard. It sounds like a hard situation to be in. I'm sure it's very painful to feel like you can't help. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry that you're having to go through it. There might be some things on what's in the presentation that could be helpful. But again, with things like this, it's hard for me to give you direct advice because I don't know enough about you to be sufficiently helpful. But I would say that it might be useful to seek advice on it and see if the healthcare system you're in, I don't know where you are in the world, but if you're in the UK, then it would be useful to talk to your general practitioner and see if they can access support. I think generally for family members of people who are struggling, I think there is more awareness of how mental health can be impacted by that sometimes. Alongside all the lovely stuff, it can be challenging too. So it does sound painful, and if it's very painful, then again, I would look out support. Folks, I think I've got time for one more question.
Looks like we just got one. He says, Dear Chris, first of all, congrats for the presentation. Great job, interesting and very practical. Have you ever met some kind of limits or obstacle in clinical practice, considering the difficulties in awareness or difficulties to name and express emotions encountered in some DM1 patients, since ACT is very focused on these abilities? What's your advice?
Yeah, so not specifically in DM1. I'm not seeing difficulties with impairment to that extent that would impede engagement, but I have seen it in other conditions where the sense is that it's difficult for the person to have insight because of how the brain is involved and how cognition is affected. Within that, we try to make it very concrete, and sometimes in these instances, the intervention can come through the caregiver. So it'll be about helping the caregiver think about how they can support the person, ways in which they might change the environment to be workable for them. So yeah, it is sometimes more challenging, I think, when the person has more difficulties with insight into emotions, because you're right in what you've said, that a lot of what we've spoken about is about awareness of emotions and thoughts as well. So there are things that can be done, is what I would say, but yeah, it does require adaptation, and sometimes it's through the caregiver. I hope that helps. Okay, everyone, that's me finished here. I'm very sorry to bring this presentation to an end. I've really enjoyed your questions, and it's been a real honor to be here at the conference, at the MDF conference, and get a chance to talk to you all about psychological therapy and ACT. I hope it's piqued your interest, and I would direct you to those books if you are interested in ACT as well. I maybe should have said that in some earlier responses. And if you need any help yourself, then I would encourage you, if this has made you think that you might, then I'd encourage you to reach out and be open to the difficult thoughts and feelings that taking that particular valued action might bring with it. Okay, thanks very much, folks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graham. And I'd like to say we'll post the name of those books in the chat for everyone to see, which will remain posted throughout the conference. And next up, we have a break and a few more sessions: adaptive strength training, JOA getting to know one another, exhibitor showcase and research poster showcase, and then an NIH research funding opportunities session. So hope to see you guys all there. And thank you so much, Dr. Graham, for your time. So wonderful to hear from you, and hope to see you and hear from you again.
Oh, anytime. I'll see you later.